Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Come on in. Plenty of room up front as well, like this morning. I would like to welcome and introduce our second keynote speaker, Mr. Richard Clarke. Mr. Clarke is the founder and CEO of Good Harbor Cybersecurity Risk Management and is an advisor to leaders in the public and private sectors on all issues of cybersecurity and crisis management. Mr. Clarke served in the White House for an unprecedented 10 years as special advisor to the president on cybersecurity, serving under President George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, and President George W. Bush. In this role, Mr. Clarke also advised on counterterrorism and other national security issues and served on the National Security Council for 10 years. In his role as the nation's cyber czar, Mr. Clarke developed our country's first national strategy to defend cyberspace. So please help me welcome Mr. Clarke to our podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. How many of you have already voted? Good. Almost everybody. According to the numbers I just saw before I came over here, more people have already voted this year than all of the people who voted in the last congressional election. So something's happening out there. And it's interesting because half the people in polls and half the people I talk to are concerned about one risk: immigration. They're concerned about a caravan about to rush our border and fill our country with Middle Eastern terrorists and Central American gangsters. And the other half of the people in polls, the people I talk to, aren't afraid of that at all. They see the chief risk as being a dysfunctional healthcare system and a climate that might make the world uninhabitable in the next 40 years. So it's fascinating. We'll see what the vote is tomorrow. Maybe we'll see. Might take a few days. But it's fascinating to me because here are Americans looking at the same observables and yet coming to two very different conclusions about what the risks are, what the chief risks are that they should worry about. It was that kind of observation that led to the writing of the book I'm going to talk about today, Warnings. Like all good things, it started with my co-author and I opening a bottle of really good scotch and saying to each other, hey, did you ever notice how whenever there is a disaster, people form a commission, an investigation to find out why that happened? And the investigation always comes back and it finds that there was someone who warned that that was going to happen. Someone who saw it coming and predicted almost exactly what was going to happen and was ignored. This happens over and over again, we thought. And so we made a little list and we said, let's go back and look at some of these recent disasters and see if that's truly the case. And so we looked at the space shuttle blowing up. We looked at the Fukushima disaster where 4 nuclear power plants exploded. We looked at Katrina where the dams flooded New Orleans. We looked at the rise of the ISIS terrorist group. We looked at Bernie Madoff's scam. We looked at the Great Recession of 2008. We went through a whole series of recent disasters. And sure enough, we found that in every case, somebody had predicted it. And we thought, well, you know, that's a phenomenon that's worth looking into and maybe writing a book about. So we did. And I know what you're thinking. No matter what happens, somebody's predicted it, because there's always some kook out there who's predicting something, right? There's always some kook out there who's saying the sky is about to fall, some Chicken Little, and the broken clock is right twice a day. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who we labeled in the book Cassandras. Now, who is Cassandra? Cassandra was, in Greek mythology, a woman who was blessed and cursed by the gods. She was blessed that she could accurately see danger coming. She could accurately see the future. Now, that's a pretty good blessing because you could probably clean up on the stock market if you have that capability. But she was cursed because the gods put a hex on her that no one would ever believe her. And as a result, when she saw that her city, Troy, was going to be attacked and would fall, and she went around predicting that, no one believed her, and she went mad. So our Cassandras are people who predict things and who are right, because Cassandra was right. Our Cassandras in the book are people who predicted things and were right and were ignored. But more than that, our Cassandras are experts in their fields. Now, this is how we tell the difference between a Cassandra and a Chicken Little. A Cassandra, under our definition, is someone who is an expert in her field, that prior to making the prediction in question, you did a poll of the experts in that area, they would all agree, wow, she's a recognized expert. She's an accomplished expert. And these Cassandras don't just wake up on the wrong side of the bed one day and say, oh, New Orleans is going to flood, or oh, the nuclear power plant is going to blow up. These Cassandras are data-driven. They're driven by empirical information, frequently data that they themselves collect. They design and collect the information, but then they go out and show that information to their peers. And we went back and we interviewed lots of these Cassandras. We found them, we interviewed them, and I'll get to this later, but we also found some present-day Cassandras who are predicting things that haven't happened yet. And so we had a pretty good sample of people who we thought were Cassandras to interview, and they all, men, women, young, old, American, Japanese, whatever, they all said the same things. It was uncanny. It was like we were interviewing the same person over and over again. He said, I looked at the data. The data clearly indicated there would be a disaster. I was horrified. And then I hoped I was wrong. And I went to my peers and I asked them, here's data. Show me where I'm wrong. And nobody could. But also, nobody did anything. Nobody did anything to prevent or even mitigate the coming disasters. And so a lot of these people got a little agitated because another characteristic of all these Cassandras is they take it personally. It's not just a scientific experiment, here's the results, they publish them, no one does anything, they walk away. No, these Cassandras all take on a personal sense of responsibility because they think it's their job, because they discovered the disaster, the impending disaster. They think it's their job to warn people. And so they run around with their hair on fire and frequently just look more and more irrational, and more people think, no, this guy's a kook. Let me talk about a few of them. There was a guy, an engineer, a civil engineer in Japan, who heard that Tokyo Electric was going to put in 4 nuclear power plants in one place on the coast north of Tokyo in a little town called Fukushima. And he looked at the site, and he wandered up the hill, And he found a little rock halfway up the hill that said, in ancient Japanese script, "Do not build your house below this line." And he did a little research as to why that rock was there. It turned out that 400 years before, there had been an earthquake. And the earthquake produced a tsunami. And the tsunami caused a tidal wave that went all the way up to that rock. And so our civil engineer went to hearing after hearing after hearing and tried to get them to deny the licenses to Tokyo Electric to build at that site. But he was ignored for a lot of reasons. He was ignored. And so they built 4 nuclear power plants at that site. And you know the rest. There was an earthquake. And the earthquake produced a tsunami. And that giant wave came in and crashed all 4 nuclear power plants, knocked them off the grid, caused them all to explode, and make a huge swath of that area of Japan uninhabitable, and cost Tokyo Electric and the government of Japan hundreds of billions of dollars. We found another engineer, guy, a professor at Louisiana State, civil engineer who looked at the dams and dikes around New Orleans and said, these are not going to withstand the Category 5 hurricane. And he testified, went to the governor, went to hearings, and for all of his labor, he was fired from his job at Louisiana State. And you know what happened. Category 5 hurricane overtopped the dikes and dams, blew them open, flooded the city. Over and over again, we find these people who were absolutely right and were ignored. And so we ask ourselves, why does this occur? So in the book, we tried to do a little amateur social science, and we look at 4 categories. The nature of the issue they're talking about, the Cassandra herself or himself, the decider, the decision maker, and then the critics of the Cassandra. And we looked to see if there were commonalities among each of these things so that we could do a little decision matrix that would help people figure out if what they were looking at was a Chicken Little situation or was what we call a Cassandra event. So we take these 4 categories, these 4 people, 4 categories, and we have for each of them 4 or 5 different characteristics. And you can score high, low, medium, nothing complicated about this, whether the person you're talking to is a Cassandra or not, whether the decider looks like he's a Cassandra or not. And what do we find? When you look at the nature of the issue itself, which is probably the most important thing here, the overwhelming reason why people did not pay attention was a cognitive bias that we call initial occurrence syndrome. Now, we call it that because we're trying to sound like social scientists, and so we have this phony name, initial occurrence syndrome. What it really means is it never happened before. If the person is warning you about something that has never happened before, even if their data looks good, even if they're an expert in their field, you tend to ignore it. Now, there are lots of psychological reasons why that's the case. One of them, I think, is you don't really think you're going to be blamed for ignoring it. Because you can always say, well, that never happened before. How was I supposed to know? Initial occurrence syndrome. Hillary Clinton writes in her book, What Went Wrong, about our book. And she says, you know, I think Russian meddling in our election was a case of initial occurrence syndrome. We saw it. We knew it was happening. The government knew it was happening. and no one said anything, no one did anything because, well, at the end of the day, we really didn't think anything could happen like that. We didn't think it could be significant because it had never happened before. And over again, as we went through the disasters and looked at the rationale that people gave after the fact for not doing anything, the most common explanation was, this has never happened before. Well, that's crazy when you think about it, because what's history? History is a series of things that have never happened before. 1492, 1776, all the dates that they made you remember in high school, those were dates when what? When something happened for the first time. We all know that things happen for the first time with regularity, but when it comes to dealing with risk, when it comes to listening to experts who are telling us an inconvenient truth, we tend not to pay attention if it's never happened before. Now, if it has happened before, and it's happened recently, we put all of our time and attention into worrying about it, closing the barn door. So that's the nature of the issue. If you look at the nature of the Cassandra herself, here's what we found. And we were helped by an observation by an Israeli psychologist who said there actually is a thing called sentinel intelligence. Sentinel, like the guard, sentinel intelligence. This Israeli psychologist said, there are people, I may be one of them, who can't help themselves. It comes naturally to them. They always ask, what could possibly go wrong? And I thought about this Israeli psychologist as I was hiking in the Shenandoah Mountains with my friend, and she said, oh, what a beautiful day. Look at the trees, look at the sky. And I said, where are the bears? What do we do if a bear pops out? If you're that kind of person, you automatically walk into a room and look for the security cameras. You automatically walk into a room and look for the exit doors. You automatically, in every situation, say, what's the worst case scenario? Well, there are people like that. Probably most of you, given what you do for a living. And what we found when we looked one by one at the Cassandras, they were all people like that. They were all people who had a tendency to say, in any circumstance, given any situation or any problem, what's the worst case scenario? And then to ask, what's preventing that from happening? And then to go beyond that and say, those things that are preventing it from happening, how good are they? Then we looked at the decision makers. Why is it that these decision makers decided to do nothing? Well, in many cases, it's because they all had their own agendas. You know, you come into office as a CEO of a company, or as a president of a university, or president of the United States, and you are selected because you have an agenda. You're not selected because you have no clue what you want to do when you take the job. No, you're selected because you have an agenda in mind. So imagine you're that decision maker, and you've got your agenda in mind, and you've already allocated resources to make that new agenda happen. And some guy walks into your office and says, I'm sorry, Mr. CEO, I'm sorry, Mr. President, you've got cognitive bias, and you should really not be doing your agenda. You should be spending your time and your money and your resources on my issue. My issue is more important. That's the way it looks to the decision maker. They have agenda inertia. Their agenda is pushing them along, and they don't want to be shifted from that agenda, no matter what the facts say. And then there's the nature of the issue itself. Increasingly, we live in a technology-driven society where no issue is simple. Issues are increasingly complex, technical, and for a lot of decision makers, you get sort of magnitude overload, complexity overload. I work in cybersecurity. One of the things I do as a consultant in cybersecurity is to talk to CEOs, talk to boards of directors, and try to explain to them the risk that they're running with their cybersecurity program, because they're almost always inadequately funded. And the problem that the CEO has, the problem the board has, is when the CIO or the CISO comes in to explain to them the nature of the cyber risk, they talk in Greek, they talk in geek, they talk in a series of terms and with complexity that, frankly, the CEOs don't understand. And that insight from my own personal experience is what we found when we looked at some of these case studies in the book, that decision makers didn't have the technical chops, didn't have the technical background to really understand the evidence that was being presented to them. And their reaction, rather than saying, well, gee, I don't understand that and you're an expert, their reaction all too often was to say, yeah, I don't understand that, go away. And so in the second half of the book, rather than just looking at past Cassandras, we looked around to see if there are any Cassandras out there today. Anybody or any issue, any combination of a person and an issue that kind of matched our little matrix of the issue, the decision maker, the audience, the critics. And we found a lot. We found a lot. They include sea level rise. We found a fellow named Jim Hansen, who is a NASA climate scientist and is now at Columbia University. And he has been predicting sea level rise for years, and his predictions have always been accurate. And his predictions today are that the UN Climate Change Conference, the Paris Climate Change Conference, and the UN model is all wrong. He thinks it's going to be far worse. And he thinks it's going to be far worse much more rapidly than the UN panel did. And he gets very excited about this, and sometimes carried away. He does things like chain himself to the White House fence and get arrested by the Secret Service. That, by the way, is not unusual. It's a little extreme, but it's not unusual with our Cassandras. They get excited when people don't pay attention to them. But if he's right, our economy is at risk. Not just our coastal cities. Yes, we will lose southern Florida, and yes, we'll lose parts of New York and Boston and other coastal cities. But if he's right, our economy is at risk. Because the cost of losing all of that property, the cost of losing all of that investment, the cost of moving all of those people, the cost of building new cities will be so extraordinary that we won't be able to afford it without canceling the defense budget. We won't be able to do both the defense budget and healthcare and do all of the things necessary to deal with climate change and sea level rise, if he's right. Now, he may not be right, but when he shows his data to experts, other experts in the field, and we interviewed the other experts and said, what's wrong with Hansen's data? They all had the same reaction. We can't prove he's wrong. But then again, he's not really using the scientific method. So we went back to him and said, well, Dr. Hansen, they say you're not using the scientific method. And he said, yeah, you're right. I find it impossible to melt Greenland 3 or 4 times. Sea level rise was not the only concern that we found. We found a concern with CRISPR-Cas9 and genetic engineering. And our Cassandra, in that case, was actually the woman who invented CRISPR-Cas9, who said she wakes up in the middle of the night worrying that she may have created something that, yes, it will cure genetic mutations, yes, it will cure disease, but it could also be used to create supermen, to not only take care of genetic defects, but to do genetic enhancements. And she worries that someday she'll read in the newspaper that her technique is being used by the Chinese to create super soldiers or to increase the IQ level of a whole generation. We found people worried about artificial intelligence and machine learning, afraid that someday machine learning programs will take over the operations of networks and will do things that none of us will be able to figure out. We've already seen some signs of that. Google created a couple of artificial intelligence machine learning bots, and those bots began communicating with each other. And to make the communications faster, they wrote their own programming language, which Google couldn't figure out. That kind of scared even Google, so they unplugged them. It's actually why I'm not as frightened by that possibility as my co-author, because I think you can always unplug them. At least, I hope so. We found one NASA scientist out at Stanford who was worried about the Earth being hit by a giant asteroid. And I thought, I've seen that movie. And so I went back and looked. And in fact, there were 2 movies. And there were 2 movies that came out the same summer about giant asteroids coming to hit the Earth. And we didn't really have to worry because Bruce Willis got in a spaceship and saved us. But this NASA scientist, who was one of the most respected astrophysicists of his generation, said, yeah, because of his efforts, NASA has now scanned the heavens for giant asteroids that would be, in fact, Earth killers, that would be like the asteroid that killed all the dinosaurs. And NASA is 90% sure that there is no such asteroid within 200 years. No such asteroid can hit the Earth within 200 years. 90% certainty. But our Cassandra pointed out that the kind of asteroid that could wipe out a city, they have only 30% confidence nothing will hit the Earth because they haven't done the mapping. And moreover, if they suddenly discovered an asteroid that could hit a city, were inbound, as actually happened a few years ago, and they discovered one was 2 days out, and then it hit in the middle of the desert in Sudan. We do not have a capability. We don't have a program, we don't have a system. We don't have Bruce Willis. There is no way to stop that incoming asteroid today. So what we found is there are people out there who are making predictions today who fit all of our criteria, and they're being ignored. Sometimes they're being ignored because people don't understand the technology, as in the case of CRISPR-Cas9. Sometimes they're being ignored because what they're worrying about sounds like a science fiction book. It's too outlandish. Sometimes they're being ignored because it's not clear who is supposed to do anything about it. So all of this caused us to suggest that what we need at the national level, probably at the corporate level, is to have sort of an office of Cassandra. An office of Cassandra, or you could call it a national warning office. A place where a multidisciplinary team, doesn't have to be a big team, looks for people making these kinds of predictions. Actually looks for them, hunts them down, proactively looks for Cassandras, and then runs the tests on them. Asks, are they an expert in their field? Are they data-driven? Has anyone been able to disprove their data? Do they make these kinds of crazy predictions all the time? What's their track record? And if the evidence shows that they kind of match the profile, then start to take steps to deal with the issue. That doesn't mean throw out your agenda. It doesn't mean give them all the resources they want. But it means put that issue under a watch, under a monitor, and start collecting more and more evidence. And if the evidence starts going in the direction that this person predicted, then start hedging your bets. Start developing reaction plans. Start trying to figure out what you could do to disrupt and prevent the disaster they're talking about. Or, if you can't do that, what can you do now to start mitigation strategies? Having plans, having a little bit of resources put aside to take them seriously. We think that would be a great idea at the national level. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, just as there are these people who were accurate in their predictions, weren't there some people who were inaccurate in their predictions? Weren't there Cassandras who matched all of your criteria, and then the thing they predicted never happened? Yeah, there are a few. There are a few. I'll give you one example. You may remember this if you're old enough. When Gerald Ford was president, shortly after he became president, public health experts came to him and said, there's going to be a killer flu, just like the 1919 Spanish flu, which killed millions of people. And it's going to happen next year. And we don't have an antidote for it yet. We don't have a vaccine. And we don't have time under the normal FDA regulations to develop a vaccine and test it and get it out there. So we need you, Mr. President, to go to the Congress and get the money for a new vaccine and get the Congress to waive the FDA requirements of testing and all of that and start vaccinating people. And Ford believed them. They were experts. They had a good track record. They had data. And of course, the flu never happened. It never materialized. But thousands of people who had the vaccine had adverse reactions. So yeah, there are a few cases like that. But we think if you apply our methodology, you'll be able to spot them because you put those trends under monitor, under hedging strategies, and you notice when in fact the evidence doesn't come in. When the evidence doesn't come in that there's a flu epidemic starting somewhere. But if it does, you're ready. That's the message. That's the message of warnings. So what I would ask all of you to think about, and all of you to bring back to your corporations, is have you in your industry, in your company or in your industry, have you got a group like that, that is open-minded, that listens for Cassandra, that listens to hear her voice, that listens to hear her warnings, and doesn't just discard them because they're inconvenient, doesn't just discard them because we don't understand it, the data or the technology, doesn't just ignore them because we'd rather not think about something as outlandish, something as complex, something of the magnitude that she's talking about. but rather takes her seriously enough to test her data. To test her data even when all the other experts disagree. Because whenever one expert discovers something, at the time of the discovery, all the other experts disagree. And if they're right, if the Cassandra is right, eventually all the experts come around. But don't say, oh, that person's wrong because all of the other experts say something else. Have an open mind. Check the risk, because that's our job. That's our job as risk managers. That's our job as managers in general, to look out for those risks and to have strategies for dealing with them. I hope if you get a chance to read the book Warnings, you will see a way of doing that you can apply in your companies and your industries. So let me stop there and be glad in the remaining time to take your questions. I think we've got some microphones. So if you have questions, observations, please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you. And just, if you would, since I don't know everybody here, state your name and where you're from.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. So you have in the room with you, as you mentioned, many risk managers, I think, who have been in that position of going to their executive teams with warnings. What advice would you give them to improve the success rate of being heard?
You know, one thing I think that's useful is when you're before a board of directors or before a CEO, and you're in this case where you're Cassandra, and a lot of us have been there, and you know you're going to be in that situation. I think it's actually useful to step the board or the decision makers back and say, you may be, we may be, in a Cassandra-like situation. Describe for them the Cassandra phenomenon and say, look, it is frequently the case, this isn't a rare occurrence, it is frequently the case that good decision makers make bad decisions about risk because of these cognitive biases. And it's not like you're a bad person because you have a cognitive bias. It's not like racial bias or gender bias. Cognitive biases are things we all have. We all have biases about information. We all have biases about risk. And what we need, you say to the CEO, is we need a system that evaluates those biases, identifies those biases. Because the CEOs who get in trouble are the CEOs who didn't know that they had biases, didn't think about the phenomenon of cognitive bias. But the good CEOs, the good boards of directors, are the ones who recognize that risk itself of not thinking about what are my biases. So rather than talk about the specific issue initially, talk about the issue first in the context of cognitive bias and how it destroys companies. Cognitive bias and how throughout history it has led to defeats of really good people, of really expert people, of really well-qualified people who didn't realize that there was this thing called the cognitive bias. And then you can talk about some of the cognitive biases that we mentioned in the book. Then, having opened up their aperture a little, then talk about the specific issue. Yes, sir. Over here in the red shirt.
Hi, I'm Glenn Wilson. I'm from here in Maryland. Given your extensive background in cyber risk, are there any Cassandra events that you're concerned about? I mean, I can think from a banking standpoint, I never thought there'd be a day there could be something called jackpotting, that somebody would just, all of a sudden money would just shoot out of ATMs in a whole network. But I'm just curious, do you have some particular concerns?
There's a chapter in the book about the Internet of Things. And we have a particular Cassandra named Joe Weiss about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, let's define it first, is any electronic object that is connected to a network, and that network is connected to the internet. And so it ranges from surveillance cameras, including your nanny cam, or the cam in your nursery that looks at your baby, all the way up to jet airplanes, automobiles, fax machines, Xerox machines, printers, elevators, Coke machines. They're all connected to the internet now. And they all have diagnostic devices inside of them. Well, it turns out that the explosion in internet connectivity has gone from something like 500 million devices a few years ago to now 30 billion devices connected to the internet. Almost none of those devices were designed with security in mind. So there are devices, be it the Coke machine or the elevator or your car, that can be addressed by someone over the internet. And there's no firewall, there's no intrusion detection system, there's no authentication and identity management system. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, as some hacker friends of mine have demonstrated, if you're driving particular kinds of cars, Corvette, Jeep, a few others, as you're driving down the highway, a hacker can hack into you remotely, throw on brakes, and lock all the doors while you're in the middle of I-95. That's not a crazy possibility, that's been demonstrated over and over again. Because cars are now internet addressable, and they don't have security devices in them. Or what else could happen? Let's talk about those surveillance cameras. One particular kind of surveillance camera all over the world, all over the United States, made by a Chinese company. 300,000 of them got hacked in one day by one bot and taken over. And you think, oh, somebody wanted to look through the surveillance cameras. No, people were not doing that to take photographs. They were taking over the surveillance cameras to use them as computers to do a flood attack on banks. And so those cameras shot off messages and created a flood that knocked banks offline. So the chapter on the Internet of Things is an example of the cybersecurity risks we have when people introduce new things into the cyberspace sphere, into the internet, without thinking in advance of the security threats. That's true throughout the IT world. People rush new products to line, and they never think that, oh, you know, there are crazy people out there. There are hackers out there. There is Russian intelligence out there. People will take advantage of anything that's networked that is not secure. And we are still to this day adding billions of devices a year to the Internet of Things. So that, when I think about cyber risk and Cassandra, that's what I think about. Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Worthen, and I'm from Houston. The Y2K crisis was a case where some people spent tens of millions of dollars and some people did absolutely nothing. And it was widely predicted to be this disaster was going to come. But when the stroke of midnight hit, there wasn't a worldwide incidence of any major disaster whatsoever. Was that a case where Cassandra spoke, was listened to, but she was wrong?
Well, we specifically address that in the book because a number of people raised that with us. I'm a little prejudiced because I spent a lot of my time in the year 1999 working on the Y2K problem. You're absolutely right that when the stroke of midnight occurred on December 31st, 1999, the world did not end. But there were a lot of systems that had not been patched that did stop functioning. One of the reasons that wasn't more widespread was people did listen to that Cassandra. Cassandra was John Koskinen, was the director of the Y2K program in the United States and the director of it globally. And people spent billions of dollars redoing their software so that wouldn't happen. There was an elaborate program to identify every piece of software that could have that problem and fix it, and to monitor when it was being done, industry by industry. I think Koskinen exaggerated the threat, but if he hadn't exaggerated the threat, we never would have done what we needed to do. And we did a lot. Without him saying that there was going to be a big problem, there would have been a big problem. The world would not have come to an end. But there would have been a lot of systems that didn't work. So the Y2K case is kind of in between, where the Cassandra probably intentionally exaggerated. I've never asked John that question, but he might now admit that he probably exaggerated a little, because sometimes to get people to move, you have to exaggerate. Question over here.
A number of years ago, I think it was at an RMA event, we had Bob Schiller of Case Schiller. It might have been 07, 06, 08, somewhere in that zone, describing the overheated nature of the real estate markets. And he then said, well, what have I just done? I just bought a vacation house on the water because I wanted to, and I needed it, and I couldn't wait a decade for prices to change. Is there any particular thing you believe in as an upcoming event that you're ignoring and just going about your life every day?
Well, I haven't bought property in Florida. And you know, I admitted a little while ago that I'm probably one of these sentinel intelligence people. So I've got a backup generator and I've got solar panels, and my house is 750 feet above sea level. So I do, if all of the worries and all of the concerns in the book, the one that gives me the most pause is sea level rise. Because after interviewing Jim Hansen and then looking at the new data that came in, the data, you know, I talked about putting an issue under watch and watching the data that comes in and seeing if the data that comes in supports the Cassandra. In this case, it does. In this case, the UN has had to move its goalposts 3 times. The UN has had to make its worst case scenario even worse 3 times, because the data that keeps coming in indicates that sea level rise is in fact more rapid than we thought it would be. And it doesn't move, according to Hansen, sea level rise doesn't move gradually on a linear way, it moves in a step function. And one of the indicators that he talks about for sea level rise and climate change as a result of melting glaciers is the current in the North Atlantic, which keeps a lot of New England and Canada and the United Kingdom warm. That current heat, predicted 5 years ago, would slow down as the glaciers melted. And the latest data is that it slowed down about 2%. So when the indicators start lighting up that someone said were going to happen, then I think you have to pay more attention. So whatever happens at the election tomorrow, I hope we pay more attention to climate change. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Clarke, for the wonderful presentation. We're going to start our next session at 2:45, and what we've got is this new format where we're doing some table topic breakouts. So in your agenda, there's 10 of them. The first 5, healthcare, talent, recruitment, CRE, consumer book, and board communication.